Greetings, my name is Pete Ring. My background is in military aviation and in particular fighters and choppers. I do these chats on behalf of Air Force Association New South Wales and on behalf of Wings magazine and also for our Wings Australia YouTube channel. Could I also ask that if you like our videos, then please subscribe to our channel and have a look at the description on our channel for this video, and you'll find links to subscribing to our magazine called Wings and subscribing to Air Force Association New South Wales. Today I will be chatting with Marsh and Bernie Farley about their experiences in the Malaysian Insurgency War of 1968 to 1989. This war became commonly known as the Second Malayan Emergency. In 1968, the Malayan Communist Party reignited its armed struggle from its clandestine base on the Thai-Malay border. This was prompted by regional and ideological shifts, including the Vietnam War and the success of Maoist revolutionaries elsewhere. This war then became a protracted guerrilla warfare between the Malaysian government and the Malayan Communist Party. Okay, good morning, Ken and Bernie. I wanted to ask you first up, Ken, why and what year were you in Malaysia during the Second Malayan Emergency?
Okay, I was a sumpy or engine fitter with 75 Squadron. I went there September 71 for 2.5 years as an engine fitter, and then I went back again in 1977 for another 2.5.
Couldn't stay away, eh?
Couldn't stay away.
Bernie, what about you?
I was there 1982, 83 for 2 years, and I was in the role of the Flight Lieutenant Ground Defence Officer under the Senior Ground Defence Officer, and the role focused on the training of the base personnel to man the defences, and the operation of the Ground Defence Operations Centre, which controlled all of the base defences at time of threat.
Okay, thank you. So, did you know each other during the second tour that Ken did?
No, both of Ken's tours were prior to my arrival.
Just prior to your arrival. Just quickly, without getting too far into it, what caused the Second Malayan Emergency? I know I said in the introduction it was followed over from the First Malayan Emergency, but what do you think were the main cause that the Second Malayan Emergency kicked into gear?
Ken, perhaps your take on it. You're very well read and written on this area.
Yeah, well, my understanding is that following I guess you call defeat in the first emergency, the communists withdrew to southern Thailand, and that was a safe area for them. They virtually controlled the place. And then I believe it was on the urging of the Communist Party in China to relaunch. They'd retrained, they'd regrouped, and according to an American CIA file I've got access to, they were very well trained, they were good militarily, and they decided to relaunch again in 1968 with the idea of taking over the Malaysian and the Singaporean governments by insurgency war.
Okay, thank you.
Perhaps to add to that, the second emergency was really a continuation of the first emergency.
Yeah.
The primary aim, stated aim in the first emergency was anti-colonial.
Yeah.
The granting of the Malaysian Federation independence in 1957, basically that raison d'etre for the communist movement was removed, and it resulted in the truce in 1960, but they simply regrouped in Thailand and then refocused with a restated aim of creating a independent communist state.
Okay.
So that was probably at the basis of what they were trying to do right through the whole period. They just had to reorient for the second emergency.
Okay. So just quickly, how did this emergency manifest itself to the Malaysian people?
It started out, like I said, in 1968. And for the first few years, and this is according to the sources that I've read, they were really just testing the water, proving themselves, coming to grips with the battle, building their networks in Malaysia. Then in about 1973, there was a three-way split in the Communist Party. The biggest, there was I guess you call them the traditional Communist Party. There was a Marxist-Leninist faction, and there was a smaller faction that only had a few hundred members. But following that, they started to try and outdo each other. And it erupted in about 1974-5. In fact, the Singaporean academic Ong Wee Chong, in his book Malaysia's Defeat of Armed Communism During the Second Emergency, describes it in three stages. There was first the initial stage up to about 74. Then there was the outbreak of the real heavy stuff from 74-5 on into the 80s, and then it just wound down.
So how did the Malaysian people experience the fact that there were insurgents in Malaysia? Just with what was in their face when they were just living in the different towns, etc.
There were in different towns and stuff communist activity. There was booby traps. There was actually different to the first emergency. The first emergency was basically fought in the jungle. The communists had come out of the jungle, attack something on the edge of the jungle, and go back in. The Marxist-Leninist factions took it into the rural, into the metropolitan areas. There was 3 or 4 attacks in Kuala Lumpur itself. The chief Malaysian police officer was gunned down, I think, in 75 in the middle of KL. The chief of police in Perak was gunned down in the middle of Ipoh in peak hour traffic in the afternoon. There was an attack on the police field headquarters in Kuala Lumpur with the grenades thrown over the barracks. It was Hilnam, a few police. They bombed the National Memorial in KL.
Okay. So they were quite active all over Malaysia.
Yeah. And, in Penang itself, there were red flags. There was a rocket attack on what was known as the Men Barracks. And there were booby traps and red flags and other signs of communist activity in the Penang.
Who was in the Men Barracks at that stage? Were the British still in the Men Barracks when the rocket attack took place?
I don't know. I think the British had withdrawn. The Men Barracks is now the part of the University of Malaya, University of Penang.
Okay.
And it wasn't. I don't think it was called the Men Barracks by that stage, but it was what was the Men Barracks.
Okay. So thank you. So over to Bernie. How did the Malayan or Malaysian emergency present itself to you as a RAF-based Butterworth person, one of the RAF-based Butterworth personnel?
To be honest, I was informed by the intelligence reports that came to the base. We now have on open source. Ken and the Rifle Company Butterworth Reference Group have done a wonderful job in amassing a great deal of material from the National Archives and other declassified sources. And the comments that I'll make really utilise that information rather than any personal information that I may have in relation to what the actual security threat was between 1970 and the end of my time in 1984.
So just let me know though, how did that get in? How did the Malayan emergency, that second emergency, how did it come to be in your face? You were
the Malaysian armed forces, and we were in direct contact with 6th Brigade in Singibatani, just to the north. We were also in direct contact with the Malaysian police, and more particularly their field force elements. The Malaysian police weren't simply civil police. They had a paramilitary element, which were called the Police Field Force, and they used infantry tactics, and they were equipped with light armoured vehicles. So really, they were a paramilitary force, and we, in the Ground Defence Operations Centre, interacted with those. On the base itself, the Malays were responsible for the outside the perimeter, and that was mainly the Malaysian Army, but the security analysis at the time basically advised that they were fully engaged with activities closer to the border and out in the jungle regions, and they didn't have the assets to commit anything back towards the base. We really were on our own as far as defence is concerned at the base, and the closest, if you like, military or kinetic assets that we had was the police field force element that was at Coolum, some 25 kilometres to the east of the base. On the base itself, the perimeter defences were primarily Malaysian Air Force. They had an element similar to the Airfield Defence Guards called the Handau, and they had manned perimeter security positions. They were armed, and that was on a 24-hour basis. They controlled entry with armed guards. They also had a quick reaction force, although the security analysis advises us that that capability was not seen as significant. It certainly wasn't anywhere near what the Rifle Company Butterworth had. The Rifle Company Butterworth provided a section 24/7 as a quick reaction force, and they were armed. We had RAF police military working dogs on the flight lines out of hours. They were also armed on an as required basis, and we had the RAF police providing patrols of the married quarter areas predominantly, Penang, and they could be armed as well. They had their own integral assets. So,
and there was quite a big police, Air Force police contingent up there.
It was fairly large. It managed the patrols of the married quarter areas both on Penang and around Butterworth. Look, in numbers, my guess would have been in the 25 to 30 personnel. So that was fairly significant. On the base itself, we had a defence plan, and the defence plan involved the perimeter defence of our squadron areas. Each of the squadrons that were there had a specific defence flight that received additional training, and they guarded the key points, and they reinforced their outer perimeter within their squadron areas. The base squadron provided a flight, which was 33 personnel, and they were trained to a higher level. They were a backup to the Rifle Company Butterworth. They were trained in basic infantry tactics, and they could go in and do counter-penetration. If our perimeter defences were penetrated, they could do that, and we could leave the Rifle Company Butterworth in its role of quick reaction force.
If I could add something to that.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, how did when you were a suppy on the Mirage flight line, etc., how did that affect your life?
That didn't affect me. I do know guys that were there before me. I got there in September 71. I think the bombs pulled out in about March of 1970 or 71. I do know guys before me that did sentry duty. These were techos on the flight line with loaded rifles, with rules of engagement that allowed shoot to kill. But having said that, I was going to add to what Bernie said, in that there was a shared defence plan between Malaysia and Australia for the defence of Butterworth. The reason that came about was because one of the reasons was the resurgent communist threat. The Australian government was of concern that the Malaysian Air Force did not have the resources to adequately defend Mirages. In fact, the Malaysian security police came under the control of the army rather than the Air Force, and they could be withdrawn at any time without warning, leaving the base undefended. And when you look at the JIO documents from the 1970s, it's quite clear that the Rifle Company Butterworth was the prime security defence mechanism there. They were a quick reaction force. They were fully armed and they were on standby. They had their ammunition next to them ready to go at a moment's call.
So the Rifle Company Butterworth were Australians?
Yes.
Okay.
After about 1973, they initially came from the Anzac forces in Singapore on a monthly rotation. That was made permanent in 1971. And then when they withdrew the Australian battalion from Singapore, they rotated them on a 3-monthly rotation from Butterworth.
So they were actually stationed at Butterworth?
No, they were permanently at Butterworth. They were rotated from Australia.
Okay.
And the secret documents show that they were there for security and no other reason, although it was publicly promoted for training and flag flying and a whole lot of other stuff.
So did you guys have, Bernie could comment this as well, but did you guys have confidence in the perimeter defence of Butterworth?
Basically, the security analysis was that from an Australian perspective, we couldn't guarantee that the Malaysian army and the security forces could stop an attack on the base. And the threat assessments basically came in 3 phases. Ken mentioned those. There was the 70 to 74 period, and that's when the communist terrorists were rebuilding their networks and establishing themselves. Then it moved to a higher level threat from 75 to about 81, when Vietnam fell and there were other successes of communist movements throughout the area. And that was the absolute high rate of activity in that period, 75 onwards. And the security assessments that have been declassified reflect that. It moved into a third phase from 81 through to 89, and it ebbed and flowed, and it was more a political aspect at that stage where the communist terrorists were attacking Malaysian government officials, kidnapping their families, holding them for ransom, and it was a propaganda war more than an actual area of attack. I think the one thing that we've got to note is that the Malaysian Air Force's fighter squadrons were used in a ground support role to the army who were deployed into the jungles. They were actively participating in bombing missions, and the security analysis basically says that they were a high-level threat from communist terrorist attack in retaliation, and there was no guarantee that the communist terrorists would confine their activities to Malaysian Air Force areas, and that Mirages and RAF personnel were under threat during such an attack.
So if I could add to that, you asked before about the impact on the local populace. In 1978, might have been late 77, 78, I recall a few roadblocks in Butterworth itself. They were paramilitary roadblocks with the barbed wire across the road, the submachine guns, all that sort of stuff. And the security information we have confirms that there were curfews in the Butterworth region in around 75. There was actually curfew region in the state forest about 20 kilometres away, in Coolum Forest. And I have a mate who actually had a girlfriend, and he told me one day that he was going out to see his girlfriend at night, turned the wrong way, got held up by a Malaysian roadblock, and he was told the only reason he was still alive was because he was wearing a crash helmet, because most Malays didn't wear crash helmets in those days, and the crash helmet saved him because he turned the wrong way and gone into this curfew area.
That'll teach him. You got to laugh at some of these things despite the fact it's serious.
I was part of the briefing team that briefed new arrivals to the base. So
Yeah.
about every 2 weeks, a 707 flew in during my time.
Yeah.
And they settled into their accommodation, be it the RAF centre or be it their actual married quarter that they were moving into, and Singley's, of course, the single quarters on the base. The next day, they fronted to the theatre on base, both the partners and the husbands, most of which were the service personnel. They were briefed on the security situation. We didn't go that heavy in relation to the partners, but in the second half of the briefing, they went off with the chaplains and were taught about the support services that existed, and higher level briefings were provided to all of the service personnel. I think that was the first time, well, I'm sure in my case, it was the first time that I'd heard about the second emergency in Malaysia. There were no pre-departure briefings, and this differed significantly from the Rifle Company Butterworth, who had a pre-deployment training period of at least 3 months, similar to what we have for most of the forces that were deployed into the Middle East in more recent times. That didn't exist for RAF personnel. They basically sat in the theatre and you could hear a pin drop for most of the time when we outlined the security situation. So the families were impacted. There wasn't a lot of discussion. I think that most of the families chose to look on the bright side of life, if we can use an analogy.
Yeah.
But they were conscious of the fact that there were areas that you should not go. There were times, particularly at night, that you shouldn't travel, and that there was a communist terrorist threat. The schools were briefed. Children received lectures from RAF police mainly about booby traps and not picking up toys that were thrown into their front yard. And all of these things did happen. The RAF families were affected, and there were ongoing briefings, particularly through the schools, of the families in relation to the threat that married quarters in those areas were subject to.
So is there any evidence of any attempted incursions into the base or into the married quarters?
The evidence, there were fence breaks very consistently. The difficulty was discerning between whether these fence breaks were simply theft by local people. There were assets there, and or whether it was an insurgent group that were doing reconnaissance or potentially planning explosives. Unless you caught someone, it was very difficult to distinguish between those two. A novel story that I might add early on, and Ken may be able to reflect on this a little bit more. At one stage, the cabling was being stolen, electrical cable for the copper content, and a significant component of the runway lighting's cabling was stolen. This happened a few times, and the ultimate deterrent turned out to be leave the runway lights on at night, and no one touched the cables after that.
Yeah, I can't recall that, but I know that there are, this is anecdotal, but there are anecdotal stories of people who found booby traps in their front yards. This was in Butterworth, not in Penang, and I lived in Penang when I was married, and actually I spent a lot of time there living there when I was a singly as well. I had a house on the island I spent a lot of time at. But I do recall the first security briefing and being warned of booby traps, and that the Malays were dropping bombs on Ching Pang out there in the jungle somewhere. And it's interesting that in 1970, the last fatality to the communists in Singapore was a 6-year-old British girl. She was the daughter of a serviceman. She was killed by a booby trap placed in the children's playground. So they weren't mucking around. Now, when you talk of, we do have, there's anecdotal evidence of shots being fired onto the base. But there is one story I came across recently, and this was from a service policeman who was called out to report a gunfire shots and stuff near the married quarters on the base, on the mainland. When he got there, he was met by fire from police. But then when the police worked out they were Australians, they had their police sergeant, I think it was, had been wounded in a gunfight. Now, that's anecdotal, but there's a newspaper, I found a newspaper report from the time that speaks of that same incident. You know, the facts don't quite line up, but it was also a time of severe press censorship. And there were obviously Australians who heard those gunshots and I think even saw the aftermath of it.
So you're talking about gunshots between Air Force Police and Malaysian police?
Yeah, but the Malaysians had been involved in the Malaysian police force. The service police were called out because there was a report of gunfire shots from the Maori quarters. And whether the initial gunshots had been shot by a terrorist or by just a criminal, no one knows. But the fact is that, you know, it was that sort of situation where they were told to expect terrorist activity in the area.
So was there any security entering the Maori quarter area?
Yeah.
There was a families protection plan that was in place. There were the base defence plan, which was a shared defence plan with the Royal Malaysian Air Force. And I spoke before about the elements that the RAF provided, supported by the Rifle Company Butterworth. They were mirrored by the Royal Malaysian Air Force. Now, the Families Protection Plan was a supporting plan to the shared defence plan, and there was also a medical plan, a medical evacuation plan that related to up to and including mass casualties. And it's got to be acknowledged that Fort RAF Hospital was a significant medical facility. It had a full surgical capability that existed during the Vietnam War, where casualties from Vietnam were flown there, they overnighted, and they were re-stabilised if they weren't stable with further surgery, and that existed. The RAF Hospital also had a maternity capability, a maternity ward, and that capability was mirrored on Penang with a medical centre in the RAF centre. So the plans that were there and the support that was provided, in relation to the Families Protection Plan, it had 4 phases to it. There was normal security where people went about their life. There was a warden system that was implemented if there was a threat situation, and basically people stayed in their homes and the wardens communicated with the families. In a middle stage, those areas were guarded and those tasks were allocated to a combination of the RAF police, the local Malaysian police, and they could be supported by the Rifle Company Butterworth elements, and also the base squadron defence flight that was additionally trained for infantry style tactics. In a third phase of the Families Protection Plan, that involved centralising all of the families into the RAF centre and onto the base, and that was normally a precursor for what was considered to be a probable evacuation of the families from Butterworth.
Okay, so
and if I could add, and I was going to say, if I could add again, my understanding is that the service police did patrol the Maori quarters regularly, as Bernie said. They were armed when they did that. They had loaded shotguns with them, and so the families were not left unprotected. There was a regular patrolling.
Okay.
And that was probably more so in the Butterworth area itself, because that was the one more likely to come under attack.
So now when you're talking about being receptive of news because you're in country, what did you see of, besides those incidents you mentioned earlier, which were quite serious, how did the Malaysians go coping with this terrorist insurgency problem? And did they manage to suppress it to degrees so that it started to, they started to take control, or was it always right up till towards the end a big problem?
Certainly in the Ground Defence Operations Centre, we received regular briefings from the Malaysian Army and they were conducting operations in the jungle, most particularly in the Coolam area, 25 kilometres to the west of the base. But up on the Thai border was the high activity period where Malaysian regiments and battalions patrolled very regularly. I think there is a compilation of all of the different incidents where Malaysian forces were killed or wounded by IEDs and also direct attacks. The communist terrorists attacked isolated police and military installations, particularly in the west of Malaysia or up on the Thai border. And these happened on a very regular basis, particularly in that mid-period, 1975 to 1981, which was the high activity period for aggressive actions by the communist terrorists. So that was reported certainly to the RAF security elements, and it wasn't published, as Ken said. There was a moratorium on what could be published, but the Times, the major Penang paper, did have intermittent reports of casualties. On the base, what we did see was that the Malaysian choppers returned very regularly with casualties on board, and I was a manager of the fire services there, and the fire services were called out, if not weekly, certainly fortnightly, to hose out the Nuri helicopters that were the troop transports because they brought casualties back and they were full blood.
So at the end of all this, you went back to Australia. Were there any ever any medals issued for that sort of service, or was it just a peacetime service?
Probably about 2001, 2002, following what was known as the Moore Report. The Moore Report only looked at service in Malaysia up until, well, if you read the official documents, it's called service in Southeast Asia up till 1975. But Moore only looked at service up until the end of the confrontation with Indonesia. So after that, the Australian Defence said, well, we need to look at service up to the end of 1975 and then maybe through to the end of 1989 when this war came to an end. They concluded that it should be non-warlike service, and so therefore it was the, what do they call it, the Australian Service Medal or the Australian Service Medal 1945-75, depending on when you were there. The first one gave you, also applied for Singapore up until the end of 1975. Now, that should grant operational service recognition. It doesn't. The Australian Defence say, oh, but you know, this medal, which is clearly by regulation for prescribed non-warlike service operations, not for peacetime service, but the Australian government has argued, and the Defence Department, oh yeah, but it's for peacetime service, which makes a mockery of the medal in my book. We, myself, the Army Company, and many other people, including Bernie, say no, this should have been warlike service, because if you compare it to some other operations, and I will say UBON, when you look at it, UBON from 1965, I think it was, till the end, was a shared joint defence of Thai airspace. Butterworth, on the base, there were two separate sets of rules of engagement at Butterworth. One was the rules of engagement which applied on the base, and one was applied for people moving off the base, like if the Army Company were going for training at the rifle range, they were not authorised to shoot unless in self-defence. On the base, the sentries patrolled with loaded weapons, bayonets fixed. This is according to the ground defence plan. If someone didn't halt when challenged, and there were three challenges, halt or I shoot, halt or I shoot, and that was repeated in Malay. If they didn't shoot, if they didn't halt, or if they ran away, they could be shot within the perimeter of the base, which is very similar to UBON post-65 with the pilots in the air. And if you look at it, when you look at what Moore says, the threat to UBON was slight the threat to Butterworth, according to the Joint Intelligence Organisation, was low, which I would suggest was a higher priority. You could also say that at Butterworth, at Eubon, the Airfield Defence Guards, I only know this from what I've read in Moore, patrolled outside the base and found evidence of communist activity. Australians did not operate outside the base, but we have confirmation of communist activity outside the base. And the Australian government was quite concerned that even if they had a couple of battalions there, it wouldn't have been enough to protect them from the threat of mortar attacks and rocket attacks and stuff like that. So it's quite a different scenario. But if you look at the rules of engagement, the fact that the pilots at Eubon were on a 5-minute alert because they couldn't sit in the cockpit waiting for the alert, whereas at Butterworth, the rifle companies sat in their quick reaction room with their loaded ammunition boxes right next to them. If they were out patrolling or training on the base, they had to carry the live ammunition with them at all times, so that at all times they could react. And I'd say that the comparison there is quite strong.
When it started to come to an end in the middle to late 80s, was that largely because the Malaysian government was getting on top of it, or was it just the Malaysian Communist Party lost its motivation?
Ken, I think the high activity period in the late 70s was the area that we should focus on, because Ken mentioned the split of the communist organisation, Marxist-Leninist faction and so forth, and they were all out to prove they were better than the other elements of the CT. The fall of Vietnam emboldened insurgent groups that were communist-based everywhere. Look, in relation to the families, we have the documentation, briefing letters to DCAS, and true credit to Ken and the Rifle Company Butterworth Reference Group, who've basically camped at the National Archives and gained access to these declassified publications. So, yeah, there's a medal in that for you, Ken. I've got to say, you've done an awful lot of work in relation to this. But those documents and direct evidence that was led to the recent review, the Defence Honours and Awards Tribunal, advised that the RAF headquarters Butterworth provided advice to the Australian Defence Force and indeed the government that the families should be withdrawn in the middle 70s, the 78, 79 period in particular, or 77, 78. That advice was not seen as appropriate, mainly on the basis that international relations would be adversely affected if the Australians withdrew military personnel, squadrons, or indeed the dependents. And it would provide a significant propaganda boost for the communist terrorists at the time and go against the efforts of the Malays to counter communist terrorism.
When the peace agreement was signed in 1989, were the members of the Communist Party, the Malayan Communist Party, already sort of neutralised, or were they still strong enough but lost their commitment?
The problem
I'd basically say that they were an older group. They hadn't been able to actively recruit a younger cohort.
Right.
And the significant elements, we saw that the first emergency petered out when Malaysia gained independence and they lost their reason for being. The second emergency, there was a radio station broadcasting out of Peking. It was called the Voice of Malaysia, or the Voice of the Malaysian Communist Party. And that continued with Chinese support until 1981. In 1981, the Malaysian government and the Chinese government, Chinese communist government, normalised relations, and part of that agreement was that those broadcasts would cease. And they did cease in 1981, and that's why we see a third phase happening from 1982 to 1989.
A slow
The other
rundown.
problem,
Eh?
so the problem for the communists was that split. And this is what Ong Wee Chong says in his book, that when they split, they tried to outdo each other.
Yeah.
And in doing so, they exposed their underground network. They'd carefully built this underground network up, probably starting from about when was the first defeat? 1966.
Yeah.
So they'd started to rebuild their network and plant stuff. They had stuff planted in the jungles of Malaysia for food and weapons and all that sort of stuff. But when they started to outdo each other, they exposed their underground network. And once the underground network was destroyed, and without backing from the Communist Party in China, they were basically defeated.
If you got any other comments you want to finalise with before I pull the curtain down?
I think the recent inquiries, and indeed there's probably been 4 or 5 inquiries. Ken's probably better informed than I am on that. Service personnel and 2022, the most recent inquiry focused with Rifle Company Butterworth, but service personnel who are aware of the full situation in Malaysia basically want respect for the role that they performed and recognition for their service. It's not about money, it's not about anything else, it's basically respect for the service that they provided to the Australian government and through that to the Australian people.
And I could add that, and this is what I call the pub test. There was a war, that's acknowledged. The Malaysians from Butterworth were prosecuting that war. The enemy were active outside the fence. There was a shared defence plan where Australians were responsible for the defence and protection of Malaysian assets. It was a Malaysian-owned air base, assets and personnel. It was under the control of one commander. Now, if the Australian government is believed, half those troops were at war and half the troops were on peacetime duty. And if that makes sense to you, then you probably see things different to what I do.
Yeah, man, if that makes sense in the pub.
Yeah.
Okay, I'd like to be the pub, but I can't. I don't want to be the pub because it's you guys telling your stories, and I'm very aware of that.
No.
I was actually up there during some of the time, twice during the time you're talking about. So
Yeah.
I actually sort of have my own experiences about it, and they're not far different from yours. So I'd like to thank you very much for joining me, and I'll just say goodbye, and thanks very much for talking to us.
Thanks for the opportunity.
If you've enjoyed this chat, then please subscribe to our channel. Our channel supports veterans directly and indirectly. We are all volunteers. Additionally, if you go to the description of this particular video, you'll see links to the Australian Military Aviation History Association and links to Air Force Association New South Wales, and you'll see the subscription button to subscribe to our premium aviation magazine.